now, what you're all here for. Let's first just do a quick intro to remember why you're here, again, for the topic of how to build your innovation provider ecosystem. We all know it's important to understand that many innovation options are available, and which ones, though, will fit into your company's goals and your culture. That's what we'll be talking about today. Your choices range from software to innovation partners, and all really can offer value, but is the value what is right for you? Okay, so today we're very fortunate to have innovation design thinking experts on our panel from Ralph Lauren, Simmons, and LPL Financial, who have gone through this already, and they will be discussing how to evaluate and identify the partnering and the tools, options to help you with your innovation efforts. And they'll also help you to understand which options may fit best with your goals and company culture, as I mentioned. So let's go ahead and introduce first Jason Burns. Hey, Jason.
Hi.
Hey, Jason is the Senior Vice President of Product Innovation, Global Operations at Ralph Lauren. As the Principal for Product Innovation, Jason is tailoring a team and process to help Ralph Lauren identify unique value-added and consumer-focused opportunities in key product areas. Jason, we're very, very happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, can't wait to hear what you have to tell us. I'm sure it will be very, very informative. And we have Beth. Beth Mercurio is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Simmons Industries. Hey, Beth.
Hi, how are you?
Good. And Simmons is a third-generation family-owned plumbing manufacturing company. Beth is responsible for discovering and scoping innovation pathways for the organization, really ensuring that Simmons is well-positioned for relevance and growth in the future. So she also has a very relevant background to share with us today. So thank you for joining, Beth.
I'm excited to be here.
And we have a repeat panelist, Aisha Tatano, who always reminds me to pronounce her name to rhyme with piano. And I always think I am getting closer. So thank you for keep coming on so I can keep trying, Aisha.
No problem.
Aisha is the VP of Innovation and Design Thinking at LPL Financial, which is the nation's largest independent broker-dealer. It's responsible for adoption of design thinking principles across the enterprise and on major projects and initiatives. So again, you can see all three panelists have a very relevant background. And I am Gretchen Hoffman, Vice President of Marketing at Altitude, a design and innovation consulting firm who was acquired this year by Accenture and focused on product innovation and design. Altitude is based in Boston with clients including Under Armour, Nike, Colgate, DeWalt, Thermo Scientific, and more. And today my role is really as the moderator. So since you're here to hear from the panelists, let's get into the meat of this and talk about how to build your innovation provider ecosystem. In order to get us started and kick this off, it would be helpful to hear from each panelist a little more on really talking about sharing a picture of how they think about today's topic and how their area and company is organized and what resources, external or internal, they're using. So to do that, Jason, would we be able to start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're organized as a function that doesn't rely on any internal R&D because we really don't have any. So, you know, as a premium fashion brand, we are really out there as a company looking to excite people about what we do and what our aesthetic is. The idea of bringing in an innovation group really requires the company think about developing an ecosystem that needs to be almost completely external. And so, when I was building the team, it was, okay, well, we're going to need to have people who are subject matter experts in certain areas, but also people who are able to manage these external resources. And that ecosystem needs to be obviously broad. We do everything from home goods to lighting to our core apparel businesses. And therefore, I would say the vast preponderance of our resources are external, and then we start to go internal when it comes time to execute.
Excellent. And Beth, how would you say what you're doing may vary or applies here?
Yeah, it's actually pretty similar to Jason. We too, due to our size, so we have about 275 employees. Simmons is a third generation family owned company. So when we looked to innovate, we sort of said, we do not have the internal R&D capabilities. We certainly do new product launches and line extensions, but as far as looking at like the future and a more disruptive type of innovation, we did not have the internal resources to do that. So we have a team that I'm leading that includes sort of what we consider our core innovation team. So the CFO, the CEO, the president, the VP of corporate strategy and marketing, and myself, to really work with our external partners and bring in the people that we know do this and spend all their time on this to help us really understand where we should be innovating and why. So we're really at that first stage of innovation where it's exciting because we do need other people to help us realize the right pathways to go down that are outside of our normal, very typical product extension, product lines within the plumbing industry. So external resources have been really critical for us and will continue to be so. And as Jason mentioned, there's definitely going to be a critical time frame where we need to say, hey, wait a minute, now we know where we're going and exactly what we need to do. Let's look at what capabilities we need to bring in-house. We know that day will come. We're not there right yet.
Yeah, it does seem like, the SMEs are key. Where are you going to find them? And if you want to scale and grow as quickly as possible, sometimes you do need external. But again, I don't want to bias any of the answers. Saisha, what are you finding?
We're somewhere in the middle, so we're probably in size in between the two companies. We've got about 3,000 people, and our group is set up as a small internal consultancy that's available to the senior leaders to use across all different types of projects, things like software development, all the way to process and product rollouts. So a good variety of things, and we really think about our vendor ecosystem in three buckets. We've got our vendors who help us scale our own operations, so people who kind of act as a proxy for us and do what we do, and that might be things as as scope refined as hosting a design session, or it might be as expansive as having a consultancy parachute in and take a work effort for us because there's not enough of us to do it. Our second bucket are the vendors we use to provide design thinking and innovation tools and experiences to our employees at large here at LPL and some of our advisors and investors as well. These are going to be things like brainstorming software or crowdsourcing software or the software that we use to run experiments. And then the third group of vendors are the vendors that we interact with to create minimally viable prototypes. And that's the bucket I rely on them the most for. So that's where I need them the most. And in that space, particularly when you're creating minimally viable prototypes for things like services, vendors can come in really, really handy to quickly assemble an idea where maybe we don't have expertise or bench strength yet. So not only would they be actually in this case, let's say a service provider for our customer, through us for a couple weeks while we're running a test on a minimally viable prototype, they also give us the opportunity to learn about how that, the thing that we're buying from them, the service we're buying from them, how it actually works and operates. And it gives us an opportunity to kind of train the trainer as we go through our minimally viable prototype process. And that's the space because of scale. We don't have a discrete R&D budget. So whenever we're doing development or testing inside of a project, we have to use the project's budget to kind of move forward. And that's where we find vendors very, very helpful. They apply to us in kind of a freelance capacity, which makes them very cost efficient. And, like they're able to parachute in pretty quickly into a project and get some stuff done. So those are the three ways we find, those are the three kind of buckets in our ecosystems that we see vendors in.
Yeah, it's a great way to look at it. Jason, can you talk a little bit about what options you have tried and how did you decide what does work best?
Yeah, so, we've, in the short period of time that we've been around, I've used a lot of different types of groups, from design consulting groups to help with visualization and storyboarding to, software implementations around, how we manage our programs and pipeline. And then we also have startups involved, in what we do. We have one project that we've been working on where we have, I think, 8 different partners around the country, from a Fortune 50 to, really tiny one-person startups involved. And so, and really everything in between, open innovation search firms. Really, there's such a huge breadth of groups that you can use. The way I look at it is, what do we need to accomplish and what's the right tool for the job. You know, certain design firms, for example, are much more willing to do a, hey, I just want you guys to do a storyboard around this idea, where other firms will go, hey, I'm a full service firm. I want to be doing, you know, consumer work and ethnography on the front end all the way to execution. I don't want to talk to you if you only want to do this sort of one little piece. And so it's really, you know, I think having those relationships and knowing what tool to use for the job. You know, if I'm looking for a technology to, you know, deal with manufacturing, for example, I'm probably going to go to one of the open innovation search firms rather than a design consultancy or a professional services consultancy, as an example.
Excellent. And Aisha, what have you found for options and what's really worked for you?
Yeah. So I think, you know, what your ecosystem looks and feels like probably depends on where you are in your maturity cycle, right? So like when you're first starting, I remember when I first started in this area, or when I'm beginning to start a practice inside of a new company, I might heavily rely on like my subject matter expertise vendors, and not only to help scale my reach in my organization, but also to build my bench strength and knowledge, right? And then when you kind of transition to, you know, what your plan looks and feels like for your company, and you've manifested it, and now you're kind of doing the business of the business and design thinking, where you're getting down to the nitty gritty, I think you rely on different types of vendors. And that's really, so that's kind of where we are in our journey right now here at LPL. So our ecosystem, the places where we most heavily depend on resources outside of ourselves today are, we're at the point where we've outsourced all of the subject matter learning that doesn't have to do specifically with a project or effort that's going on. So all of our training that's about design thinking in general, or innovation in general, we have now outsourced to folks who create really great experiences for learners in a really small amount of time. In our tool space, you know, if you're really planning on stretching the reach of, you know, your crowdsourcing or your whiteboarding or your brainstorming, I think that's when you really rely on folks and software to kind of help you push your reach out to more users. And like I said, lastly, when you're creating minimally viable prototypes, I have never been in any situation, in any ecosystem, either mature or immature, where vendors were not a really big part of a minimally viable prototype. With that being said, I have mostly designed services and not products. So in the service space in particular, you know, if you're designing a product, you might bring in a material specialist, or you might bring in folks who know specifically about that part and piece. When you're doing services, not only do you get the person who knows about that part and piece, but they can actually provide the end service to your consumer for that short amount of time that you're testing your MVP. So to me, that's one's always present. It's just the changes in the other two facets that kind of flex or change or evolve as you kind of mature in your practice.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like it's really, really thinking about where you are in the journey, and then what subject matter experts you have in-house, you know, what your needs are overall, right? Where the gaps are. And then also from a software standpoint, what do you need to have happen, and what tools do you need? What do you have internal you can leverage, and what don't you, right? I mean, but I think it really starts with assessing your journey, your goals, your objectives, and then trying to figure out your gaps, your needs, and then your gaps, right?
Yeah, so, exactly.
I
think that part of the ecosystem changes, the vendor part of the ecosystem changes a lot as you mature, at least for me, right? Because I rely on vendors a lot to learn things. Like that's what I personally get out of them when I'm working with a vendor, is to me it's an opportunity to just suck knowledge from another space. So, you know, exactly, Gretchen. So as I'm learning things, you know, as I'm picking up something new, and every time, that's the nature of innovative work, right? It's a learning opportunity. You're doing something that hasn't been done before potentially. So everybody is learning. And so I've noticed as my needs or my group's needs has changed for what they need to learn, that's kind of what predicates how we interact with our vendor community.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Aisha, you've talked about software versus services a little bit, right? And different needs. So how are you evaluating the software versus services, or even consultants, for the fit?
Yeah, so those are completely different vendor sets. So the way I think about it is I focus on my end customer. So if my end customer is developing a piece of software, they tend to have a personality set and a jargon that they use and a way that they construct their work. And I need to make sure that my vendors understand that ecosystem really well and quite frankly can like talk the talk, right? Because I think we're all pretty aware that with technical people, that's a pretty important aspect. So if we have to navigate a whole bunch of language divide, it really makes the onboarding for vendors tedious, which takes away some of the value of a vendor. So versus if we're talking services, obviously you can't bring a software design vendor into a business group and have them feel like everything is kumbaya and ready to go. So how I pick my vendors usually has to do with my business audience and the output that we have, and I keep different groups of vendors depending on the audience. Like the groups I would bring in to convince a group of executives to do something, or maybe do some ethnography or field research, completely different than the group of people I might bring in to work with a team who's having a problem with a Scrum developing a new piece of software. So I like to have, as I've done this throughout my career, I've built my, what I call my back pocket of vendors. People like Gretchen, I considered you guys an altitude in this category, right? Like you're some of my go-tos. If I have questions that are just, that I can pop in and ask you, you guys are always there to do that. I like to have that good group, like a network of vendors in my back pocket that I can take out for each situation and apply if I need to.
Great, great. Good to hear it. So Beth, let's get you back in the conversation here. So
Yeah.
what criteria, Beth, did you use for selection, and really what proved most valuable?
Yeah, it's interesting because listening to Aisha and Jason, I'm thinking about us. We sort of went at it. I think our first approach was we had 10 criteria. That's a lot of criteria because I think in some ways we were looking for the one-stop shop, the person who was going to bring us, from the beginning, ethnography, what are your customers really looking for, what are the outcomes you need, all the way to the end. And one of our criteria was actually a capability around manufacturing and sourcing. I mean, we literally were like, all right, we want from the very beginning all the way to the end. And that's a learning process, because now I would say those 10 criteria were too many, right? Because just as you guys have said, you need to have a really specific focus on what you need and then find the people that fit that the best. So for me, in a more generic way, I feel like strategic thinking across any vendor is so important because it always links back to what the outcomes are. What are you really trying to design here? What are you trying to build and innovate around? So strategy and research, I think, are critical. And then I also feel like fit and a dedicated team. So Aisha, your go-to made me laugh a little bit because it's so true. I mean, if you find a team of people where there is a right fit between the organization, you do continue to go back. There's a comfort level, there's a trust, and it ends up making it easy to work together. So I think that actually matters a lot. We joke about that even in a hiring practice. It's very hard to hire for fit. I feel like the same way with your vendors, right? But when you find the people that fit within your organization and how you're structured and how you guys work, I think that's critical. And you should continue those relationships and try to see what about those relationships are working and apply that for other vendors, right? What is it that I care about? For me, I think one of the big things about fit comes down to candor. So if I get a really good vendor, they challenge me. I don't like vendors that just sort of like always react to what I'm saying or what I'm thinking. I think the ones that challenge me and sort of say, have you thought about it this way? And I'm not sure that makes sense, and ask some hard questions are the ones that build the trust, right? So I think candor and trust become really critical in longer term sort of relationships that'll bring you to the true innovation, because it's a journey. It's not a short-term thing. So even if you're finished with one aspect of it, you're going to have another journey that needs that same skill set. So I think that's really important as you look at who you're selecting to be a part of your team and ecosystem.
It's
That's
interesting.
a really good point, Beth. Yeah, I was going to say, I hadn't thought about it, but I bet you there's lots of people who start these practices and have like that unicorn list, like if I could find one vendor that just would do it all, that would make your life so much easier. But I think that, and you probably learned this, I think, where that falls apart is you're robbing yourself of the learning of all the different perspectives that you get from all of these vendors. That's kind of the big thing for me is, the vendors bring their own unique point of view. And so, that's very enriching when you're trying to figure out how to get stuff done. And so the more voices that have like a little bit of context and a lot of experience that you can add to the mix, I think that the more, the more round you get in your thinking about what you need to do next.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's
I agree
interesting
too.
on this. Oh, go ahead, Jason. What are your thoughts?
I was going to say that, the relationship piece of it is so critical, I think, when you've got more of a broad-based vendor, right, who's going to be able to hit on a lot of the different things that you need, where, if you're dealing with a startup who's got a technology, you don't really have a choice, right? You hope it works out, but it's a little bit different, where, a broad group that might have design, research, engineering, all of those things. It's all about the relationship. It's how you work together. Do they understand your organization? I think all of those things that you touched on become so critical. So I think that was a great statement.
Yeah, it was interesting. Beth and I had talked about this because we were at Altitude, we were developing a paper on basically design to win. How do you select the right, and it was focused on innovation and design firm as opposed to all the tools, everything else, because that's what we are, right? And it's where I was talking to Beth, if you might recall, on, what is the criteria? And definitely fit was a big one, which you'll find, if anyone wants to find the paper, it's under Altitude Inc., under the Insights section. It's one of the papers we have there. But it's interesting because I talked to various ones of our clients and some folks that aren't clients, and they also had talked about how it was also important that you make sure the people that do the pitch are the ones that are going to be on your account. So in other words, because you're addressing for fit, right? You want to know that they're not just business development fit, pitchers, right? So understand who you're really assessing and going to work with. And then another one that came up that was interesting was also making sure, and you mentioned this, Beth, about are they okay challenging you, right? In other words, making sure they feel confident enough to challenge you, but not put you down, right? But to make sure you're working very collaboratively, but truly they're comfortable challenging and have the expertise to be able to do that and back it up, right? To bring you to a better solution. So those were a couple things I just wanted to comment on, because I think those were points that came up a few times, Beth, when you and I talked, and also through the different discussions. And one other one that I thought was interesting is really being clear and comfortable when you talk to someone is, are they looking out for the best of your business, not just what's best for them, right? But really what's going to help with your business, because then they're really investing in the long term. And that's what you want to make sure, so you feel more comfortable, right? And you'll be successful. So anyway, I just thought that was helpful to comment on that. Yes, Jason.
I was going to say, if I'm working with somebody that's not looking out for my business and I'm paying them, I can guarantee I won't work with them a second time.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, that's it. You're done after that. If I'm paying, I should definitely be getting your loyalty, right?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So, but those were just a few points I think that kept coming up. And I mean, you're right, Jason. It's like, come on, make sure you know that, right?
It's pretty simple.
So let's talk about the blended approach, or, like, have you taken a blended approach? I think, Aisha, you and I had talked a little bit about this. Or did you choose just one path over another? Why?
Yeah, I really, it's hard for me to say that there would be a situation where you wouldn't blend, right? Because, and by blended approach, I mean, kind of thinking about how you're providing your services to your consumer, whomever that is, right? For me, my consumer is my business ecosystem here at LPL. They're my customer, right? That's how I think of them. And so when I'm thinking about how I provide service to them, I want to always have as many real options as possible, because the long and short of it is, and I'm sure all three of us can attest to this, four of us, you too, Gretch, the people part is really important here. When you're doing innovation or design thinking work, by its very nature, you are pulling people through a scary process, because change, particularly change that we can't see the end of, is just unnerving to folks, no matter how free thinking or forward thinking they are, right? So I have found that the reason I really need to think about vendors is because I sometimes need a proxy for myself, right? And when I'm out with my customer, when I'm spending time with them, I am really kind of listening for where they are nervous or scared or frustrated, and I can't be there every time they feel one of those emotions. So when I build a vendor ecosystem, what I'm trying to build is, where can I supplementally put other people into play where they can offage or allay those fears and those frustrations, and because that is then a service to me as a service provider, and a service to my consumer as the person who's kind of participating in all of this. So I think not only do you have to blend your approach? Meaning you've got to be the primary provider, and you've got to have some vendors approaching you, with you, assisting you. I think you also have to think about what your ecosystem looks like over your life cycle. So what does it look like when you're just starting? What does it look like when you're first getting on your feet? What is it going to look like when you mature up and you're in that teenager phase where you know what you want to be when you grow up, but you're still kind of awkwardly figuring out how to provide it? What does your ecosystem look like in each of those phases? Because in my mind, it should look different, because the needs of your end user should be changing and evolving and morphing with you. And how you show up is going to depend on, effectively really depends on where those folks are interpersonally. So, one person can't do that. And honestly, even a small team of people, we've got, I think 3,500, 4,000 people here. Even a small team of people can't spend the face time that is required to do that well. And so how we deploy vendors, when we deploy vendors, how many vendors we deploy, how often we deploy it, really is a reflection of where the people in my ecosystem are, and what they need out of us to make change. And like I said, I don't think a person or even a small group of people can do that really well for the reach that we're shooting for, right? So for that 3,500 people.
Great points. I just want to remind the folks listening in, please be sure to look at the question and answers tab. We will leave the last 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions. If you don't have any questions, look at them anyway, so you can vote on the questions that are in there, because we will get at least to the ones with more votes. Okay, so thank you if you could take time for that, and also engage with us on Twitter at altitude_inc. And then also do visit our website. I mentioned the paper that we have there. We have other free valuable resources at altitudeinc.com. So I'm done with the sales pitch, moving back to the panel. All right, so rolling on here. How has your criteria for each changed or evolved since you started, Beth? And if so, why and how?
Yeah, I think I sort of mentioned the big evolution for us was to know that not one firm can do everything for us, right? And so we need to really make sure that we understand what it is that our desired outcome. And one of the things that I think I learned the most that now keeps coming back is to make sure that whatever we're doing is driven by a deep understanding of our customers, right? So I think sometimes one of the things that we sort of learned along the way as we went through the journey was you can often get really excited about a product, a service, a technology, and just keep driving towards that, right? And sometimes you can lose sight of like why you're even doing it, and the big why part. Like, why are we creating this? What is the real true understanding of why we're doing this? Because I think you have to keep checking back in, because it takes time. So I feel like for us, we did have to change some of our criteria, and actually we had to change a partner, which was really, you can imagine, changing a partner is a big deal midstream in an innovation process, but we needed to do it because we were getting too we lost our way in pushing out a technology rather than really understanding what the true value was to our end user and what the outcome should be. So I feel like now when we look back, everything that we look at as far as vendors are concerned and who we choose to participate with and why is always linked back to the outcome for our customer. Like, what is it that we're trying to do? What are we building for them? And I feel like you have to make sure that you weave that through in choosing who you're going to bring on board. So for example, thinking about the engineering and manufacturing, that can only be one element. You really need to understand why are we doing this? What's the value that it's going to bring to them? And that may change who you decide you need in your ecosystem, right? If you really stay focused on what that customer is looking for and what you can bring to drive them value. So I feel like it's actually, the criteria has just been really refined such that every time we're looking at, okay, who do we need to partner with? We always go back to the why. Like, why are we even here? Okay, we're here because our customers need this. This is the insight. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, who are the people that can help us get there? So I do feel like our criteria have gone way down to really looking at the strategy and the research needed. And then obviously it will change, right? So we also do have to look at engineering resources when we're far down the line. We're going to have to do that. We're already, though, starting to talk to people to understand who are the people that we feel like will bring those elements that are important, still grounded in what's important to our customers. So I kind of feel like a long-winded answer. It's definitely been refined to focus on things like strategy and the end result being customer focused. So as long as they're always thinking about that, asking that, and challenging that, as well as internally you're doing that, I feel like you're going to end up, even though you may iterate and move around, you'll end up producing something that's innovative and successful because it'll be valuable to your end customer.
Okay. Is there anything the other panelists would like to add to that? I think Beth was pretty thorough in the answer, or?
I think that sounded great.
Yeah, I did too. I think it was covered. All right. Well, I know we had talked about it a little bit earlier, and it seemed like, Beth, you got a great, that was a great answer. So I thought I'd keep rolling.
Yeah,
Jason,
good.
let's pull you back in here. How are you measuring success for the external versus internal resources?
So they're always fairly blended. So I think from an external standpoint, it's really, is the group that we're working with delivering against what we said from a project perspective and from a milestone-based perspective? We're sort of a little bit different, I would say, than Aisha, because we're, while we have obviously internal stakeholders, our end customer is a consumer. And so, we're not, while we need to obviously please our internal stakeholders and make them engaged, get them engaged, bring them along with the change, ultimately it's about, how our end consumer really feels about the product. As far as how we measure success, it really is, what have people delivered? Have they delivered against what we said? Have they done it on time? Have they done it on budget? All of those sort of standard success metrics. And, additionally, we talked about relationships earlier. Are they skilled at maintaining those relationships with my team, with the broader team that they may be interfacing with? Are they reactive as things change, on a project? Are they going to hold me over a barrel and say, hey, well, this was the timeline that we all agreed to, when actually, scope may have changed, or we may have been hung up in, some sort of decision-making process or something like that. How willing are they to flex with us? We're a large company. We have 25,000 global employees. We're very complicated from an organizational structure. So, these projects tend to sort of wend a little bit, and we need that flexibility. So that's how I would say that we measure success. It's really about are we getting it done?
Okay, which makes a lot of sense. Beth, what about you? How are you measuring? And then can you talk a little? Have you changed providers based on succeeding, not succeeding, et cetera?
Yeah. So similar to Jason, we really, I think it's challenging to create KPIs around innovation, right? Like, what is it specifically? So we too look at it deliverables, right? Did they deliver as they said they were going to deliver? And even from an internal perspective, because I think it's interesting to talk about that, I've been challenged. People have said, okay, so what about how are we measuring what you're working on? And similar to deliverables, the only way it's been able to really, I think, work well is it's activity-based, right? So what is it that I'm trying to do to narrow our focus around what we're going to innovate? What are the key milestones around the activities I need to do in order for us to get closer in around bringing a product to market or a service to market or technology to market? So I think it's interesting. You have to shift the way you think. It's not just like, did you hit a sales number? That's not going to be, it's not easily equitable when you look at innovation. I think you have to look at it over longer term, and you need to look at the activities involved and the deliverables, and if they were delivered as expected. From your second question around, did we change providers? We absolutely did. And again, I think I alluded to it. We were in a place where we were taking a really long time pushing a product out and trying to get a product out, and we lost sight of the end customer. And I think that's really easy right now in the world that we're living in. There's a lot of technology. Everything's becoming connected. So much is going on from the world outside from a technological perspective that a lot of people, I think, are just getting products out there, right? Like, we know everything's going to be connected. Let's connect it without a true understanding of why. Like, well, why are you going to do that? Like, even on the apparel side, right? They're connecting apparel all over the place. And it's like, okay, so what's the true value in connecting that apparel? What is the consumer really going to gain from that? And I feel like without the true why are you doing it? then you can go right down many rat holes, not just one. There can be lots of rat holes of innovation where you get it out there and then everyone's looking around like, well, I don't really want that. And you go, what? What do you mean you don't want that? But it's connected. So I kind of feel like, we actually had to take a step back and actually, with the help of Altitude, look at our why. Why are we doing this, right? What are our customers feeling from a pain perspective? Look at some of the insights, figure out how we can help them so that we can bring to them innovations that will make their life easier, right? Because when things make people's lives easier and they reduce pain and they delight them, then they buy them. And, we're not talking a lot about that, but we all need people to actually buy and use our products or we don't have a business, right? So fundamentally, they need to see enough value to, sign on the dotted line and pay the bill to purchase it. So I feel like for me, that's going to be something, and I think for Simmons as an organization, we feel very fortunate that we learned that lesson. We think it's part of our journey, but I do feel like now we will forever be tied to a fundamental, why are we doing this? And check back in on that. Let's not forget, why are we doing this again? Is the value still there? Did something change? Do we need to go back to our end customers and ask if something has changed or if there's a different tweak to this? So I think that really, from my perspective, was where the change needed to take place. But it was all part of a journey. I think you have to look at innovation as a journey with iteration and changes and flexibility, because otherwise you'll get too frustrated along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was well said. For us, I won't allow a project into our pipeline unless there's a very, very strong consumer value statement, right? It's just not worth the time. It's a weed. We pull it, we rip it right out, and the project's dead before it starts. And then, as it goes through that pipeline and in the portfolio management system, we answer that again and check in on it and say, is it still valuable, right? And then as we get more feedback, as we get more information, you go, okay, is this still worth doing, right? And I'll kill a program very far down the line if it seems like we're not aligned.
It's a great point.
So Jason, if you're talking from that end, are there any examples to help people on that you have changed providers and maybe why?
Midstream, I haven't had to do that here. I've been pretty selective. I've certainly, there have been programs. In fact, we just did 2 this week where we said, look, this company isn't reactive enough. They're not delivering on the technology that they promised. We're done. And we put it on the bench. And, we're willing to revisit it later, but we're not going to put any more time against it. So, rather than, hiring, say, a consulting group and switching, it tends more to be in the startup space or the technology provider space where we're going, hey, you've got a great technology that meets our need, but you can't deliver, right? Because, one of the ones this week was they were too focused on fundraising. Right. And so they were focused on fundraising rather than getting their technology to market. I don't have time for that. Right. So come back to me when you've got your funds raised and you're ready to do something serious with your technology. And until then, we're done. Right.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. What if you flipped it a little and said, what are some of the key signs that you've seen that you have made the right choice versus you've already said maybe not making a change? Why are you on the right path?
I'm on the right path if, a group is able to speak to us in our language, right? So as a 50-year-old company, with a pretty strong personality and a very strong founder who's still highly involved in the business, a company that can speak to us in our language is critical. We did storyboards on a program late last year, and we had our design people, really in there critiquing, the collar placement on these sketches, right? And so a company that can react to that level of critique, becomes really important. So it's meeting us where we are really becomes super important, especially for, firms that are, design firms. We're a design-led company, right? Our founder's a designer. So we think we know design. And, so does a design firm. They think they know design. Well, they may not know design in our context. So that willingness to sort of meet halfway and talk about, well, what do they mean? What does it mean to be consumer focused, for example, where we have always been sort of our vision focused and trying to, being willing to teach, being willing to listen, and being willing to sort of grow with us, I would say.
Yeah, great points. Great points. So, Aisha, do you have any thoughts? Just some specific signs where you're feeling that you've made the right choices?
Yeah, so I expect, so remember we've got these different camps, right? So when I'm dealing with a vendor who is in the designer innovation camp, I expect them to take their own medicine. So if they're preaching to me or my extended customers that you need to be customer focused, that you need to listen, that you need to understand the why, that you need to be able to respond to changing needs, that basically plug into your customer, pay attention and iterate, I expect them to be able to do that, right? I'm not going to trust their word on anything they cannot demonstrate. And innovation providers are horribly guilty of having one talk track and a different operating track, right? So alarm bells start to go up when I see them not listening or being unable to iterate. And that to me is probably the mark of being a good or bad quote unquote provider, right? When we're talking about people we partner for minimally viable prototypes, those are not necessarily innovation providers, right? That might be a really small two-person shop out of Maryland who provides this one little thing that we're trying to sell to our customers. So in that case, we have a little bit of a different bar or measure. In that case, we're really looking to see if this vendor can respond or react to our pace of change, meaning LPL's pace of change appropriately, right? So, and it can be a misfit either way. It can be that they're too quick and they're constantly impatient for our changes, and they're not getting a high level of satisfaction out of being engaged with us, or it can be the opposite way, right? Like they're not able to respond to our pace of change and we're constantly pulling them along. Either of those two things in our prototyping process is a pretty good indicator that we will not stick with this vendor beyond the prototyping process. So we usually don't change in the middle of the prototyping process unless that is in fact part of the prototype. So prototyping with vendors gives you the opportunities to do like test runs with vendors basically to see if there's a good opportunity for fit. So in that case, it's a little bit more rigorous because it's a little bit more formal when we're evaluating whether or not we want to work with a vendor to provide something for our end consumer. But it's less innovation focused. Like I said, it's almost solely beyond the normal rigor you would use to kind of check, anybody that you're going to work with, right? So are they a salient company? How long have they been around? All of that stuff. On top of that, we're looking to see, what we're looking for fit is like that first level of fit, meaning do we get along? Do we connect as humans? Do we share ideals? And then the second level of fit for us is does your pace of change match our pace of change? And if those two things pass muster, then usually that's a pretty good indicator that we'll be able to partner well because we've got like this foundational stuff in common, regardless of attitudes beyond those two things, quite frankly. Yeah, I found if those two things fit, if we kind of feel the same way about customers and feel the same way about service providing, and your company can kind of keep up with my company, and and we're not particularly fast, by the way. So I will say that more often than not, the non-fit is, because we're working with smaller companies, they're much quicker than we are. And so the problem we run into the most is not that they can't keep up, it's that we are hard to work with because, we are, compared to them, a very large company, and compared to them, maybe take a really long time to make decisions. So what we know out of, let's say, an 8-week prototype is we'll get a pretty good feel about whether or not these folks are going to be able to be patient and work with us. And if not, if in 8 weeks we see really big signs of impatience and then the frustration that comes with impatience, oh geez, where are we going to be a year down the road from now, right? So we use that as a pretty good, it's almost like a test run for some of these vendors. And like I said, what we're checking on are, can you get down with how much we are focusing on the why? Are you with us there? And can you deal with how we make change? And if those two things fit, pretty good indicator that they'll fit in general.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the different perspectives since you're from very different industries,
Yeah.
and yet still hear the similarities, right, in terms of how you're selecting. So great dialogue. So as a reminder to the folks listening in, please be sure to submit your questions. We're going to do a few more minutes of panel dialogue, and then we'll get to your questions, okay, which will also be a panel dialogue. So Beth, let's talk a little bit about decision makers. Can you just briefly talk on who are the decision makers for making choices there?
Yeah.
at Simmons?
Again, you mentioned we obviously the panelists come from very differing backgrounds, but as I mentioned, we have about 275 people, so we're pretty small and we're family owned. So right now, our innovation core team consists of the CEO himself, who's very engaged, the CFO, the president, and the VP of strategy and marketing. So we're all, and I should mention, I'm sorry, we currently do, we have a VP of engineering and innovation role that's open. That person is on the core innovation team. I'm just not mentioning it because there's not a physical person right now. We're looking, so, which is very exciting. So I think those are really the people that are in the rooms making decisions, deciding, you know, what the levers are for, do we need to accelerate? How much are we willing to invest? You know, are we not going to do something else because we are going to do this and we want to do it faster, or we want to do more of it? That's the real core team that's making those decisions. But we do have a larger leadership team that's cross-functional across the organization. And we absolutely think it's incredibly important to have their buy-in. So as much as we may have several smaller meetings and some decision-making that's happening at that highest core team level, we do absolutely bring along the leadership team as to the why, as to, you know, what our intentions are and why, so that they can challenge us and make it better, and make us think about all the different ways in which obviously some of the things that we're taking on may impact the organization. And so I think that's really where we believe it's critical. The decisions need to be made from a cross-functional space, and right now, that for us, that's happening at the highest level because of our size.
Great, great. So we're just going to ask a couple more questions, and we'll get to the panelists, or to the registrants, listeners' questions. Jason, can you just talk a little bit about how often you're evaluating the choices?
Again, this is very project dependent. So if it's a project, if the project itself is reliant on the choice, it's sort of constant, right? It's, you know, in every weekly project update, as well as in our quarterly management updates and any other sort of interstitial meetings. If it is, you know, a partner that we're using, you know, in a certain piece, it's really not a formal evaluation, right? It's more of a, hey, how are we doing? Are we delivering? What's going on? And that is a constant, you know, feedback loop, right? And, you know, I feel very, very comfortable in letting a partner know, you know, if I think that we're on the ropes for some reason, you know, why not? Again, if I'm paying for a service, I'm going to say, hey, I think you're delivering, or I think you're not, or we're behind. Do you agree? It's pretty simple.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great feedback and great to know. So I'm going to just have our panelists go around and summarize. Just pick a couple top lessons learned that you want to make sure that the audience remembers, and it can repeat what you've already said. But let's just go around the horn and give a quick summary, and then we'll get to our registrants, the audience's questions. Okay? So Beth, do you want to start?
Sure. I think key lessons: welcome challenges. Challenges are often opportunities. So look at them with a smile, embrace them, and let them in the door. And I think I've mentioned it, but I will say it one more time. Never lose sight of the people. You know, always understand the value that you're bringing to the people and your assuming your customers are people. Make sure that that's really spearheading all your innovation.
Excellent. Aisha?
Mine would be, if you're going to use vendors to supplement parts and pieces of your practices, the lesson is buying the thing does not make the thing so. So for example, buying a piece of crowdsourcing software does not mean you crowdsource now. Buying a piece of brainstorming software does not mean everyone's out there brainstorming, right? So we live by the motto in design thinking, if it doesn't stick, it doesn't matter. And so engaging with a vendor is like step one in that process. First, you've got to get the thing to bring to your people, but you still have a lot of work between contracting with a vendor and saying that this service is now part of your services. And I have seen the biggest mistake I see with vendors is people not knowing what to do first or what to do next, and hiring vendors to kind of fill that in and then checking a box, right? The next way we're going to scale our practice is we're going to crowdsource. So we bought some crowdsourcing software, check a box. That is an extremely wasteful and redundant way to move forward. And I find that my biggest lesson is that it's the first step in the process, but certainly not the last step.
Okay, excellent. Jason.
So I couldn't agree more with Beth about it being all about people. And
Jason will be reconnecting in just a moment, it sounds like. So let me just remind folks, please go to www.altitudeinc.com. We have 4 free valuable resources under the Insights tab, and it also includes the Hangouts. We've had a whole series of Hangouts, about 10 of them, with our Innovation by Design series. So I do encourage you to take a look at that. And I also mentioned the Design to Win, start by choosing the right partner paper. So again, under Insights, you can filter and be able to select the ones that you would like to take advantage of and listen to. So I see Jason is trying to reconnect. So let me do this. I'm going to have Jason jump in when he does get back. But I think in the essence of time, what I'll do is at least get us started on taking your questions. Okay, so I see quite a few here. So if you're okay with this, Aisha and Beth, I'm going to start on some of the questions so we get to them. So the first one here is from Ron. It's, what's your strategy to increase the rewards from innovation, and how do providers contribute to improving innovation success in business outcomes?
Beth,
Aisha, you want to take that?
Great mind.
I was
Great
like,
mind.
not it. No. Sure, I'll go. I feel like, I mean, honestly, they play a huge role in improving innovation success, because I think the good vendors are holding hands with you, right? So they're seeing the success with you. That's how I see it. So when we become successful because we've innovated and launched something new and exciting, they therefore become somebody I would rely on moving forward. Because I also think that innovation, we've said it happens over time, and it's not one thing. I think those that do it well are constantly innovating. So once one innovation is coming out, you're thinking about the next one, and they're always in different phases, right? It's not one. If you were to just innovate one thing, by the time you started over, you'd have missed an important time to market for something else that needs to be coming to provide value for your customer. So I feel like you always have to be thinking about what the next thing is. And those that work with you best are going to be the ones that are thinking that way too. Like, you're thinking, okay, well, we've pushed this one forward. What's the next thing? How should we be thinking about that? So in that way, I feel like the best partnerships, everybody's successful. The boat rises.
Excellent.
Yeah. Where I would say we primarily, I try to focus on using vendors to create scale of reach. That's the particular thing that I look at to my vendor community for. So if I'm going to think about scaling, spending time with people and building a change management kind of lexicon with my folks and really introducing them to new concepts or new thought processes, then if I'm going to use a vendor for that, then what I try to do to kind of double my value is, first, they have to be able to perform the primary task, meaning they have to be able to show up and be a proxy for us and our team. But the second thing we try to get out of them is, and when we use it that way, by the way, it's just a cost center, right? That is just an equation of, are these people, if you can't provide the thing, can they? Or if you can provide the thing, do they do it cheaper, right? It's a pretty simple equation. The next layer of value we try to tack into that is, are there other things we can get from that vendor by them being in our ecosystem that add to that value? And this is kind of where subject matter expertise really comes in for us. The main reason why we might reach out to a vendor is that they know something that we don't, particularly when we're talking about bringing vendors into that first bucket I talked about earlier, which is, you're scaling what you do as a resource, right? So we really try to think about how we can share that subject matter expertise beyond the problem that a vendor is currently being brought in to solve, and like, basically, how can we harvest that out of them and build more value out of it? So we will often ask for our vendors to double duty. We will, as part of the scope of what we will bring them in for, we'll say, yep, we would like you to come in and consult on, for example, how do you build a how do you build a brainstorming program that we can create templates out of and scale to our whole organization? That might be one of the things we would bring in a vendor for. We'll also ask ourselves, well, where could we have that person teach people about brainstorming in general, or where can we spread that expertise where it will make the most impact? And what we have found is, because subject matter expertise is the value that most vendors think they bring, they are more than happy to spread that value around if appropriately. So like I said, we try to double it up. We try to squeeze every little bit of value out of those dollars we spend in our vendor space.
Great points. Jason, welcome back. We did not hear the beginning. We lost you in the beginning. So if you don't mind, if you could just recap the top tips that you would like to make sure the audience has of the points that you've made, would love you to jump in.
Great. So I was predominantly agreeing with both Beth and Aisha, so I don't know if I'm going to add a lot of value at this point. But I was saying that, it really is about people, and it's about, really being patient with change. Innovation is really about change. And so, if you're going to run into this situation where, people are uncomfortable with what it is that's being done, and, being able to say, okay, I understand that you're uncomfortable, but that's actually a good thing. It's good that you're uncomfortable, because if you were comfortable, we probably wouldn't be innovating, right? And really being able to understand the line between discomfort and you're doing the wrong thing, and figuring out where that point lies is critical. And there's always tension there. There's tension between we're doing the wrong thing and this is going to be wildly successful, but it's going to be painful along the way. And really managing both that external group and your internal teams, I think is really where the innovation group inside a company is critical to help with that communication, right? And make sure that, you don't have your internal people, maybe making your external groups uncomfortable even sometimes. I mean, sometimes there's this sort of reverse thing that can happen where you get some negativity inside that starts to bleed over, and then your external group loses motivation. You never want that, especially if it's not exactly a vendor, right? I've heard this term vendor on this, in this conversation a lot. A lot of times it's actually a partner, and they're a voluntary partner. In some cases, you might not be being paid or might not be being paid very much, especially as a technology partner. They're looking at the long game. And so they start to hear any negativity because of the discomfort internally. You've got to figure out how to manage through that.
Yeah. I really have to say our panelists, excellent input. So thank you. Great insights. I hope everyone listening in is finding them valuable. We'll take a couple more questions from the audience and then we'll call it a wrap. So there's another one in here from Paul. It says, coming back to go-to advisors, how do you determine you are not just leaning on them and it never comes inside to build up the internal competencies? Basically, how do you know when you're going to build up internal competencies versus lean outside? I think is what it's asking. And what are your thoughts there? Anyone?
I think that is so in my mind, it is my responsibility as the manager of these vendors to make sure that that isn't happening. So first, know that there is going to be a knowledge exchange with everyone who's working really closely with the vendors, and that in itself can sometimes be the value. There's been plenty of vendors that I have engaged with, but I'm not so sure the output that they created was the point, right? It was the process that we all went through together to get the output that we got the most value from. And to me, that's not wasteful, that particularly if we see it through the lenses of learning to do for ourselves. If I was trying to measure it, what I would be specifically, I would measure a vendor the same way I measure our team when we're thinking about concepts. What is your reach? If your job was to create an end point or a change for a set of users, how directly did that change happen, right? Like, so in the case of a vendor, if their job is to create an end deliverable and then teach people along the way, we're measuring for both the end deliverable and the teaching people along the way. And we make sure the feedback, so I guess the answer is by being cognizant of it, like being something that we watch, that's how we manage it. There's not a lot more magic than that. We're aware that that happens sometimes. So we're focusing on making sure that the information proliferation goes as far as it possibly can. And we're making sure that we think about value both as the thing that people are doing and like what are we getting out of them as people.
Great. Well, I really want to thank our panelists. We're at the top of the hour. I thank everyone listening in. I think many of the other questions we did get to via other questions that we answered. I thank very, very much. I want to thank Jason Burns from Ralph Lauren, Aisha from LPL Financial, and Beth from Simmons. Your insights have been very, very valuable, and I thank you, thank you. Everyone else listening in, thank you for taking the time, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.